say you don't love him.
Hello everyone and welcome to this video. Now today I'm going to be presenting something quite different for my channel. It's going to be a conversation which I was a part of with Laurence Juber, who was like the guitarist with like Paul McCartney and Wings like between 1978 and 1981, like when like the band split up. So I'm really grateful to like James Griffiths for like inviting me to be like part like of like this like chat. Like it was organised by a kind of group, I think they called like Beatles Zoom, like sort of like with like two guys like in particular, like Henry Hemming and Colin Pike, who kind of like organised like the thing. They've obviously got like connections like with Laurence, and like also like a wee shout out as well. Like this group did a conversation with Kevin Godley from 10cc, I think last month, which was really interesting, and like James like has uploaded like that conversation like on like his channel. So yeah, basically like I mean like Colin and Henry kind of leads like a lot of like the conversation, but like there's kind of contributions like from everyone like in like everyone like on like the call kind of like chipping in, like asking like Lawrence like various questions. I mean Lawrence like was very generous like with both like his time and also sharing his memories like of like this era. So like in like this conversation like he talks about the making of the Back to the Egg album, like the 1979 UK tour, the cancelled Japanese tour, and then also like the end like of Wings like as well. So this video is just going to be very much like the edited highlights from that chat. I'll try to keep it to around half an hour, like but like if like you want like the full 2-hour chat is being uploaded by Andrew Dixon, who was also like on like the call, and James Griffiths I think is doing a kind of 2-part like sort of that's like 1-hour version like of it. But yeah, this is very much just like the edited highlights. So yeah, without further ado, we'll just get stuck in to the chat.
Morning, Laurence.
Good morning.
It's my enormous pleasure to introduce double Grammy winner, composer, arranger, guitar virtuoso, and one of the few musicians to play with 3 out of the 4 Beatles, plus a who's who of rock nobility. Welcome, live from LA, Laurence Juber.
Hello.
And if we can take you back to the sort of first time that you stepped into a recording studio with Paul, Linda and Denny, I think it was May 78, Rack Studios in St. John's Wood. I think that was the first session according to the research.
First session was same time next year.
Same time next year, that's right. So recording that. How did you feel when you walked in the room, and how did that whole initial session go? Because I guess it's a critical period.
Well, going into Rack, I mean, it was like it was like another session. But except it was with Paul and Linda and Denny, and Steve Holly was, it was his first session too. And I think if I recall, we recorded that song fairly quickly. I mean, it only took maybe, 3-4 takes to do. And then they subsequently overdubbed a string orchestra. The sad thing was, I mean, it was a great song, and a very classic kind of McCartney kind of movie-like ballad, but he didn't get it into the movie.
And I think it was another month before you went up to Root Studios in Scotland and spent a whole month laying down a whole series of tracks there.
We went up to Scotland at the end of May, where we rehearsed for a few weeks. We didn't do any recording, but we did shoot the video for I've Had Enough. Even though Steve and I weren't on the record, that was done right around the end of May, and it was a single camera shoot. So every scene had to be set up with, just for the one camera. So there were different camera angles that were set up. So it was like an all night thing. But which was fun because that was the first time we actually got to perform as Wings, even though we hadn't actually played on the record. And we went back up to Scotland for the month of July, was when we started recording for Back to the Egg, seriously.
And you must have got really close, obviously, all living in the same space at that time.
Oh, yeah.
How quickly did the band start to gel as a 5-piece?
Well, it really, I mean, immediately, because there was, I mean, Steve and I both brought our own musical experience to it, and just, we were doing, in that first go around in May, we were doing a lot of jamming. There was one point we were jamming on, I think Steve was playing keyboards and I think Linda was playing drums. It was either Paul or I forget. Paul or Linda was playing drums, but Steve was playing this chord progression. No, Paul was playing guitar and Linda was playing drums, and Steve played this chord progression that ended up being the instrumental section of Old Siamsa. But pretty much, I mean, there were some demos of the songs, but when we actually started recording seriously, I mean, we were just kind of making the songs work the way that they needed to work. And because of the personalities involved and the musicality involved, it just came out sounding like a band.
Well, we hope that one day we get to hear some of those demos on maybe an archive edition of Back to the End.
Yeah, it's funny because I know there was a cassette with various demos on, but I never got a copy of that. So I don't know what even exists anymore. They could have been traded by some EMI engineer for a bunch of Elvis stuff or something. That's how a lot of those bootlegs get out, is that German engineers with like Elvis TV shows, or whatever, and then they trade for Beatles or Wings or whatever, or Springsteen. It's, it's this kind of subculture.
Laurence, I'm pretty sure that you were the most musically educated person that Paul had ever had in his band. Certainly at that point. I don't know about since. Did you feel that you were allowed more input as a result of that? Because I know, for example, Henry McCulloch, one of his big beefs in Wings was that he didn't feel he had much input to be able to do his own thing. Do you think you were able to because of your education in music?
For me, the joy of working with Paul really was more important to me than how often I got to play a lead guitar solo. Because the fact is that Paul has never been a big fan of extended solos. I mean, in more recent years, he's kind of, allowed more of that. But in those days, I mean, you got your 8 bars at the most. Yeah. And so I could understand Henry's frustration with that. But I didn't feel constrained because I was allowed a lot of my own input. The first solo I recorded was for To You. When I was in the studio, Paul and Chris Thomas were in the control room, and Paul was manipulating an eventide harmonizer in real time while I was playing. So any note that I would play, I would hear a different note in the headphones. So I was just going completely outside of the box in what I was doing, and Paul, so it was like a kind of an intuitive process, a very improv kind of process.
But what were your underlying feelings about Paul McCartney as a person and as a musician?
Well, I mean, it was very easy to get along with him and Linda. It was very, it's very open, and of course I was kind of a junior partner there because, they're 10 years older than me. But I found Linda very easy to get along with, very encouraging. And Paul, is this kind of like, has this burning nucleus of creativity, and you can't help but be, impressed and engaged with that. Right. And so it kind of lifted me, to want to be able to really perform to the best of my ability and beyond for him. But as a person, very easy to work with, very easy to get along with. Was, I think that was, especially when we were working in this, up on the farm and having, being in his natural environment, or especially Linda's natural environment, because she loved being up there. It was not difficult. It was, it wasn't like Clash of Egos. I know, Denny and Paul had been kind of, because they've been working together for so long, I think there was the beginnings of some friction there. But it didn't affect the work, and we did socialize to some extent, because Paul and Linda had the kids up there too, so they're always in their family space. With Spin It On, when I overdubbed the solo sections on that, I was sitting in the control room next to Paul, and just eyeball to eyeball, and just Paul bringing stuff out of me that I didn't know I could do. So it was very much, and that kind of synergy was really, and that's something as a studio musician, has always been a great motivator for me is the synergy of working with great musicians and how the combination can kind of lead to something that is different from, you know, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
How did Paul go about announcing to the band that he was working on McCartney 2 and that was going to be coming out as his next release as part of the Columbia deal?
Well, I think, you know, Paul's entitled to do whatever he likes. And so it was like, you know, because he had the time over the summer and some gear to play around with, and you know, and he felt like, I can do an album this way. I don't need the band, you know.
Did it come as a surprise or a shock?
No, I was busy working on my own album at the time. I mean, my Standard Time record, which was stuff out of Paul's publishing catalog, was recorded right around that. It was August, September of that year. You just kind of go with the flow under those circumstances. I mean, it's not like you're going to argue with Paul McCartney saying, well, you can't do this, you know. And, you know, I think that Arrow Through Me really was a bit of a precursor to McCartney too, because it was that very stripped down kind of, you know, with a little quirkiness to it, with a double speed drum kit and stuff like that on it. That I still think is one of his best songs of that era. I think that the process by which we did Back to the Egg and then we didn't actually, you know, perform it live, you know, for some months after the record was released, I think was very much part of that kind of the slowing down, you know, because I think prior to that, they would have put the record out and immediately gone out on the road. Record comes out in June, you know, we didn't tour until November. And Columbia not having the institutional memory of how to promote McCartney, which Capitol did, I think just they kind of took it for granted that it was going to sell multi-millions simply because it was McCartney. And, you know, and I mentioned earlier the fact that you had, you know, Rumors and these albums that were, and Boston, you know, that were selling substantial numbers. If Goodnight Tonight had been on it, it would have sold a lot more. And perhaps under those circumstances, the critics would have been less critical. But, you know, I think that, and it wasn't all the critics either. I mean, it was just, you know, it was just enough to get Paul kind of feeling a bit jaundiced about it.
Do you feel, Laurence, that ultimately Paul did not keep faith with Wings based on the sales of Back to the Egg? And we're talking about a platinum selling album in America here. Do you think that was his decision to say, okay, I'm going to do this by myself? I can't cope with a critical failure, even though everyone here tonight thinks it's brilliant?
I'm not sure that that's quite that black and white with it. It might have been a contributing factor. I think an equally contributing factor was the fact that Wings was Paul and Linda's band, and Linda was just getting tired. She, you know, and they, in the course of doing it, they had moved out of London. You know, they were no longer at Cavendish, they were at Peasmarsh, and the kids were in local schools. It was one of the reasons we worked at Lim Castle, was because it was an easy drive for them. So that, and then of course, you know, by the time, you know, Paul got busted in Tokyo, you know, which was kind of very hard on Linda, because they'd never been apart for that long. And it was, you know, it was not an easy period at all. But I think it just got to the point where it was, Paul was ready for a change of direction.
How did you decide, how was it decided what was going to go on the set list? And what did you jam or record or rehearse or whatever, which didn't actually make it onto the final set list?
The place that we were kind of working it out was actually in this little, almost like a shed near Peasmarsh. There's that video that we did for the Japanese, like a little promo for the Japanese tour, where we were rehearsing. We started rehearsing Coming Up, and we did With a Little Luck, which we dropped, even though that had been a hit single. It just didn't feel right. Again, because it was kind of like a very pop single, as opposed to the band, which was kind of leaning more towards a rock and roll direction. I know that we opened "We've Got to Get You Into My Life" because Earth, Wind and Fire had a hit with it. Which I think from the Sgt. Pepper soundtrack, the movie soundtrack or something. But I think that kind of spurred Paul to say, oh, wait a minute, that's my song. And it was a good opener too.
Did you get any insight into how he would make those decisions? Like how he would suddenly say, right, we're going to just play this song now that I haven't played for whatever 10 years.
I don't recall much in the way of discussion as to how the set list was going to go. I mean, putting together a set list has its has its pitfalls, because you can say, oh, I want to do this song, but then if you do it kind of like after another song that's in the same key, you lose a certain amount of impact. So it's a juggling act when you're doing stuff like that. And I think probably my feeling was I just stay out of the way.
Yeah. So was that set list decided entirely by McCartney, or like did like yourself, like and others have like some input and like suggestions? Just considering it is quite, there's a lot of deep cuts in it, like things like Every Night and like Hot as Sun and that, and certainly like today he keeps it rather safe with his set list. So was that like the influence of like yourself, like or others?
I don't think I had any real influence on that set list. I mean, there were certain things like Cook of the House was in there because Paul wanted Linda to have a vocal. Let It Be was just such a natural thing to put in there, and I'm not sure what the motivation was. I mean, there were very few Beatles songs. We had Got to Get You Into My Life, we had Fool on the Hill, we had Let It Be, Yesterday. Not like in recent years where it's basically kind of a Beatle tribute band.
That amazing final Wings concert in Glasgow, which obviously there's bootlegs floating around, Wings Last Flight. It was professionally recorded.
Well, Jeff Emmerich engineered it.
Yeah. Will that ever see the light of day? I mean, there's been a few tracks that have sort of seeped out on the archive editions over time, bonus editions, but we've not had that whole concert, which is an amazing
I
concert.
imagine that if and when, or when and if the archive collection comes out, that would be on it, along with the Kampuchea video, and probably the Rupert demos too, because there's the Rupert Bear stuff that we did it was like a one-day thing when we were up in Scotland. That some of that stuff turned out really nicely too. Actually, amazing how much we accomplished in a day for that. And by the end, you can hear the piano starting to go out of tune.
There's just so much material from that period, visual and audio, that it could be included in an archive edition. It's we just hope Paul gets around to it.
Well, one would hope so. It's hard to know. I mean, he found the time to do 80 singles. And the box sitting over there. Yeah.
We've not heard the word Rockestra mentioned yet, I don't think, during this chat. What's your memories of that, Laurence, in terms of the vibe in the room? Was there any egos among all the people who gathered for it?
Rockestra was actually remarkably ego-free. It was really like everybody just was in there just being part of it. And that's the thing, is because Paul commands so much respect amongst his peers, that him, kind of being the musical director of it all and just kind of assigning the parts, everybody just went with it, and it's, I mean, for me, it was like remarkable because I've got Hank Marvin right next to me, who's my childhood hero. And then, next to him, Denny Lane, and then Dave Gilmour and Pete Townsend. I mean, I was in heaven, and there's John Bonham on drums and Steve Holley and Kenny Jones, and it was really it was a remarkable band, and there were a lot of technical challenges involved in it because they were running. First time I'd ever seen two 24-track machines running in sync. They had to bring in an extra console into the control room for all the inputs. But ego-wise, everybody was cool about it. I mean, and it's unfortunate that the full movie never got edited together, because the whole thing was filmed, and there was that short promo that got kind of resurfaced, but they had neglected to get releases from everybody.
Laurence, you mentioned earlier that there might have been some tension finally between Paul and Denny towards the end of Wings.
Mm-hmm.
Are you able or willing to explore that any further?
Not really. I mean, other than I know that Jojo didn't get along with Paul and Linda, but then Denny and Jojo were kind of not long after separated anyway. I think that Denny had some frustration that the band just wasn't more active. I think that and the fact that Denny was the one who brought me and Steve into the band, in order to keep it going. I'm not sure if Denny hadn't been kind of the talent scout, I'm not sure whether they would have immediately kind of done what became Back to the Egg as a Wings album. Paul might have, I'm just speculating now, but that he could have easily just gone into doing a solo album, and having all the Columbia releases be like that.
How did you feel on that last concert coming off the stage at the Glasgow Apollo, and how did the rest of the band feel, and where did you go after that?
Well, I mean, it felt good. It was a good concert, and that was the end of the bulk of the tour. I mean, Kampuchea came up after Christmas, when I think we'd all had a bit too much turkey, and that was a very long show too. I mean, we didn't go on stage until quite late, but the Glasgow show, I mean, was very satisfying, and that was kind of where we were. That was really the starting point for what we were going to be doing in Japan, but swapping out some songs. I know we had added Another Day was on the Japanese set list because that had been a big hit in Japan. And Let 'Em In was back in the repertoire. Live and Let Die was back in the repertoire. I don't remember anything else that was different, and I forget what we were dropping.
Do you think McCartney really wanted to do the Japanese tour, especially just considering what happened when he got there? Do you think it was a kind of he was almost there's a lot of theories around that he almost got busted deliberately, or was he kind of genuinely up for the tour?
We were pretty. I thought that we were in pretty good shape. I talked to Steve Holly the other day, who said he felt like maybe we were not quite up to par, but I thought that the new material had worked him well, and as you could tell, I mean, with the Glasgow show, the band was tight, and Paul was particular. I mean, his bass playing in that period, especially playing the Yamaha bass, which had much more robust bottom end than the Rickenbacker, that his bass playing was sensational, and he and Steve were just such a tight rhythm section. It was kind of an unfortunate circumstance. I mean, the fact that they decided that they were going to travel with half an ounce of cannabis was not the best move, and it almost wasn't discovered. I was standing next to him when the customs man on the very last suitcase kind of patted a jacket and then felt something inside it and lifted it up, and there was this bag of grass, and that was when all hell broke loose. But it almost, he almost got away with it. The issue there ultimately was that Paul had signed an affidavit declaring that he didn't smoke it anymore, and that was how the Justice Department were talked into giving him a work permit. And so when he got busted, some of the senior officials kind of got a little, pissed off about that, because their reputations were on the line. So that was why, they made a bigger deal out of it with Paul than they would have done with any, the reggae bands would get busted all the time, and they just take the weed away and let them do their tours. I mean.
And you were standing next to Paul at that very moment. What did he say, or what was his demeanor after that?
He turned very pale. And then, there was really, I mean, at that point, we didn't talk again until he was back in England, because he was whisked away immediately.
And what was Linda's reaction?
Oh, Linda was devastated. you know, we were kind of hopeful that it would blow over, because when we were driving from the airport to the hotel, you know, Paul was being detained, but Linda and the kids and I were driving to the hotel, and everywhere you looked, there were Wings posters. It was like just on every streetlight and everything. And we thought, well, maybe this is going to blow over. But by the time we got to the hotel, it was on the news that he'd been arrested. And the next morning, all the signage had gone away. All the posters were gone.
Did it cause any tension in the band that he'd got busted and like you were like kind of looking forward to this tour?
Well, I mean, we were definitely kind of upset. I think more upset that Paul was kind of, you know, incarcerated than anything else. But it was a disappointment, certainly. I mean, I was disappointed because I was really anticipating that the band was going to get up to the next level. You know, because, you know, we'd done what, 3 weeks worth of shows, and, you know, we were just really getting tight. You know, as you can hear from the Glasgow show, but it could have gone further.
Can I ask you about coming up, Laurence? When the single came out, were you a bit put out that he'd recorded a solo version? I know the live version got to #1 in America, but us in Britain were subjected to the studio version. So what's your feelings about the two versions? How do you compare them, and what do you think?
Well, it wasn't a surprise because we had heard it. We learned it from that, or at least the rough mix version of that. And so that was part of our show, you know, when we did the UK tour. It was recorded in the second night in Glasgow. And once Paul got out of jail, we were back in the studio. We were actually at Rack Studios when we doubled the horns. We had the horn section come in and doubled them up. And that was kind of the last I thought about it. I mean, I knew that because of this deal that Paul had with Columbia, where he had a certain number of albums that he had to deliver, and McCartney 2 was going to be the next one up. But Wings was still a functional entity at that point. It's just, you know, Paul had this solo album. But I think what it represents from my perspective is that Wings, as we were constituted, really was a rock band. But where Paul was going with his creativity, first of all with the McCartney 2 stuff, which was, you know, definitely kind of quirky and, you know, playing in the studio with electronica. But then subsequently with the Tug of War stuff and Pipes of Peace, and you could see that where when we were rehearsing the Tug of War stuff, we were doing it in a rehearsal, like in a hall. But this was material that normally I would have expected to have been worked out in the studio, because, you know, they weren't rock songs. They were pop songs and narrative songs and things that needed to be textured and dealt with in a very different way. So you have, you know, Paul has a band that could play some kick-ass rock and roll, but he's not writing stuff like that. The one song that he did have that we never actually did was No Values, which he said he dreamt he wrote a Rolling Stones song. But it was clear, you know, with songs like Ebony and Ivory and Average Person and stuff like that, that these weren't rock songs. You didn't need a rock and roll band to make a record like that. And then, you know, I think, again, with some pressure from Columbia Records, that was when George Martin got brought in. And that was really the point where, okay, so this is no longer going to be a Wings album. And that was really kind of the beginning of the end of the band. But we were still in the studio in January of 1981. Working on the Cold Cuts stuff. And a few things came out of that, like A Love for You. I'd put some slide guitar on that, and that ended up in a movie. And, you know, at that point, I was already making plans to move to New York anyway.
You mentioned January 1981 sessions for Cold Cuts. So that was obviously in the immediate aftermath of John's death.
Right.
Did you notice any kind of difference in Paul then? Did he open up to you about John and how it affected him?
No, but we had, I mean, not long after John died, it was only about a week later that we had the MPL Christmas lunch.
Right.
Paul was very, I mean, Paul was subdued, you know, he was very, there was a deep sadness there. By January, I mean, you know, we were there to work. And so it really, we didn't get into those kind of like any personal discussions about that.
Yeah.
But I do remember the day I was leaving, they were working on Tug of War at Air Studios. And I went to say goodbye because I was taking off for New York that night. And shortly before I got there, there'd been, you know, a death threat on Paul and his family in New York. And so they had some security people came in. I mean, it got uncomfortable. And I'm sure that, you know, a big reason for not touring, you know, for such a long time was just that, you know, the vulnerability of it.
And how did Paul break the news to you that Wings were no longer going to be a working band or exist at all? How did that happen?
I mean, the initial thing was when he called and said, you know, George Martin doesn't want this to be a Wings album, and so you're not coming to Montserrat. You know, and I said, okay, well, but he said, but you know, we're getting together in January because we still have stuff to finish up. But that was functionally that was the point at which, but I'd already been making plans to move to New York at that point anyway. So again, this goes back to knowing that there was going to be a limited lifespan of my involvement.
So on that last session, you knew this is it. This is the last time I'm like working with Paul. Yeah, when we did the cold cut stuff, I knew that was going to be it because I was moving. I had work lined up in New York, and then I'd only been there a couple of months, and I met Hope, and she was from LA, and I moved out to LA and reinvigorated my studio career here in LA.
And just finally from me, you recorded with George in 86, Breath Away from Heaven. How did that whole session go? And was George talking about his time with Paul or your time with Paul?
Oh, yeah. I mean, George was very chatty about his role in the Beatles and his perceptions about it. I mean, I really enjoyed talking with him.
So how have you kept in touch with Paul over the years, Laurence?
You know, I'd see him when he's in town. You know, if he's playing in town, I get messages to him one way or another. My lawyer and his lawyer speak on a daily basis on other things, so I can get a message to him, and I get emails from him periodically. So, you know, there's a cordial relationship there.
Laurence, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate your generosity with us today, and
very welcome.
We'll let you get back to the roof from Back to the Egg.
There you go. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Laurence.
Thank you. Thanks, Laurence.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Bye, guys.